Howdy, welcome to today's Huxley speaker series. We have live captioning coming to you from the Department of the Disability Center, Accessibility Center, excuse me. Today's guest speaker is Shana Lee Hirsch. She's coming to us from UW, actually Vashon Island. Shana is a research scientist with the Department of Human-Centered Design and Engineering. So I had to confess not being quite sure there was a Department of Human-Centered Design and Engineering, so I'm looking forward to that. She's been studying climate change and adaptive restoration, specifically down in the Columbia River. So will be our focus, and she's got a new book out, which we'll hear about. As usual, please post questions through the Q&A or the chat, and we'll have time for those at the end of her presentation. With that, please join me in welcoming Shana Lee Hirsch.
Thanks very much. Let me share my screen here. Okay, does that work?
Looks great.
Great, thank you. And thank you all for inviting me to speak to you. So my name's Shana Hirsch. I'm a research scientist in the Department of Human-Centered Design and Engineering at the University of Washington. I really wish I could be there in Bellingham with you all. I always like an excuse to go to Bellingham. But instead, I'm at the other end of the Salish Sea on Vashon Island, where I live, on Coast Salish, Duwamish, and Suquamish land. I want to talk to you today about some of the ideas that I discuss in my book, Anticipating Future Environments. It just came out this summer, so I'm really excited to have the opportunity to talk to everyone about it. The subtitle of the book is Climate Change, Adaptive Restoration, and the Columbia River Basin. So I want to try to cover a little bit of all of those things today. Won't be able to get into depth in a lot of the topics that are in the book, but I'll give you a little bit of an overview. So first off, I'd like to acknowledge some of the funding that I got for this book. Some of it came from the Tulalip Tribe Charitable Fund, as well as the National Science Foundation and the Northwest Climate Science Center. So thank you to all of them. So let's get started with a little tour of the Columbia River Basin, because I think it helps conceptualize the challenge of restoring salmon to the river, also the challenge of climate change, and the challenge of a large-scale scientific enterprise. So the Columbia River Basin is about the size of France. Me on Vashon Island and people in Bellingham at least are not in the basin itself, but you can see it begins on the horizon up on the Cascade Mountains, flows down the other side into central Washington, and the water that falls on most of Washington, Oregon, almost all of Idaho, all flow into the Columbia. A large part of the basin, about a third, is in British Columbia, and the basin even extends into Montana, Wyoming, Utah, and Nevada. Some of the rain, this is the Teton Mountains here, some of the rain that falls on Yellowstone and the Tetons enters the Snake River, and which is the biggest tributary of the Columbia. So the Columbia River Basin is not only large in size, it's also ecologically and physically diverse. The ecosystems across the Columbia River Basin range from high plateau, sage shrubland, irrigated farmland, orchards. We've got major mountain ranges. We've got high alpine. We've got lowland forest of many types. The Columbia River Basin also crosses many jurisdictions, including an international border, state lines. We have sovereign tribes, including both reservation land and usual and accustomed territory, private ownership, agency management, as well as multiple users. It's very complex. So the Columbia River Basin is also heavily modified. The most obvious modification is the dams, obviously. Those were mainly constructed during a dam building era that began with the New Deal in the 1930s and went on into the 1970s, resulting in now about 130 dams that are used for hydroelectric power. 31 of these are large-scale dams that have been built straight across the main stem of the Columbia and its major tributaries. And some of these dams are the largest in the world. They have multiple, sometimes competing uses, including power generation, irrigation, transportation, and flood control. They were really used to turn large parts of the basin from desert into productive farmland, some of the most productive in the world. And these modifications really created what the historian Richard White refers to as an organic machine. And an organic machine is a kind of hybrid of nature and technology that has both natural and managed elements. And of course, this modification has affected the species that call the Columbia River Basin their home. And for at least part of their life cycle, that includes salmon. The Columbia River Basin is home to 13 species of endangered salmonid. And the reason why I'm telling you all of this background is because much of the restoration work that's being done in the basin is being done to mitigate the damage coming from these dams. The loss of salmon has also been devastating, a devastating loss to the tribes, to the indigenous people in the Columbia River Basin. The destruction of salmon populations has been a profound cultural, spiritual, economic, and subsistence tragedy. And it really exemplifies the ongoing legacy of colonialism. According to Nez Perce tribal elders, quote, "One of the greatest tragedies of the century is the loss of traditional fishing sites and Chinook salmon runs on the Columbia River and its tributaries." So most of what I'm going to be describing in terms of restoration is taking place because of the impacts of development, and especially the dams to the river basin. But it's also the restoration is also taking place because of the Endangered Species Act and the listing of salmon. There's been a reassertion of tribal treaty rights, and the Shoshone-Bannock tribes petition for to list the Snake River sockeye in 1990 under the Endangered Species Act was really successful in changing the way that harm from the dams is mitigated, and it's created a restoration effort on a truly massive scale. The Columbia River Basin is also changing in other ways. I was doing much of this research in the spring and summer of 2015, which was a year that brought devastation to the environment, especially to salmon runs. Globally, 2015 was the warmest year on record to that point. In the Pacific Northwest, the warm temperatures contributed to record low snowpack. And in many areas, this meant zero snowpack. There was a drastic decline in spring runoff due to that, and drought conditions throughout the region that lasted for a long time. On top of this, a hot, dry summer increased fire intensity and frequency throughout the basin. And I'm not even getting into the issues that were going on in the ocean, such as the warm water blob in the North Pacific. I'm just keeping to the land right now to keep it a little bit simpler. But on top of all of this, so we had a really hot, dry summer, increased fire intensity and frequency throughout the basin, something very familiar to us this year. The high temperatures were also deadly to salmon. So as the fish made their way up the main stem in early summer, the record high water temperatures exceeded survivable levels and there were mass die-offs. The Northwest Power and Conservation Council estimates that around 250,000 sockeye died in the Columbia River Basin that year as a direct result of warm water. And this included well over half of some runs. The Snake River sockeye were particularly hard hit, and only a handful were returning to their headwater streams to spawn. So for many in the restoration community, 2015 was a benchmark for how bad things could be in the future. And for many, it was a kind of oracle because according to climate models, the future is going to look a lot like 2015. There's going to be drier, hotter summers, wetter, warmer winters, less snowpack, more wildfires. So despite all of this, people are still working across the basin to restore salmon habitat and salmon. And I really wanted to understand what these people were actually doing and how they were going ahead with their work in this complex basin with so many different entities, so many different interests, and so many problems. And then on top of that, climate change. So over the course of 4 years, I traveled around, I conducted interviews, and I visited restorationists in the field. I also visited restorationists in their high-rise offices. And I wanted to ask them how they were dealing with climate change. I wanted to ask them how it was changing the way they worked and how it was changing the way that they conducted their science. The restoration community in the basin is called I term it an epistemic community. It's a community that's recognized for their expertise and their ability to make claims in the world and their ability to influence policy. So epistemic community is not a term that I came up with, but it's a term that I apply to the restoration community. And an epistemic community can also be studied by exploring their interactions. And so I explored those interactions at conferences, at meetings, in historical archives, and in their workplace, and also through interviews. So what I found surprised me. I saw creativity in the face of this overwhelming complexity. I saw adaptation within science itself and within the field of restoration, as it was shifting from looking to the past for reference and looking to the future into a changed environment. So what I'm going to do with the time that I have is give you some examples of this creativity. And to do this, I'm going to tell a few stories about the people that I met. And I'm going to read 3 short vignettes from my book. So the first one is from a meeting with a restoration practitioner who'd been doing field work and project management in the upper Columbia River Basin for over a decade. Driving down the highway that follows the south bank of the Columbia, you can easily miss his field office, where he works for a tribal fisheries department. The office itself is a nondescript porta cabin wedged between the river and the highway. But from this lowly hub, he and his colleagues work for the tribe and have helped shape restoration in the region. As a project manager and restorationist, he's been witness to changes in the environment. He and his colleagues have seen the way that shifts in climate have impacted their own work to restore salmon populations and the habitat that salmon rely on. And although when I spoke to him over a year had passed, the summer of 2015 was still fresh on his mind. Like most people involved in restoration that I spoke to as I traveled throughout the Columbia River Basin, the restorationist I was meeting with this day agreed. Climate change has arrived. He described to me what it was like to be an ecological restorationist living through it. Quote, "Back in 2015, that super hot summer was destructive. It was wild. It was so hot for so long. The whole main channel was 80 degrees or more, and there would just be these clumps of fish trying to survive where a seep of groundwater was coming out. You could see that. You could see adult sockeye dying. There were mass deaths of adult sockeye because they were just too stressed. And you can kind of see how things might end up looking, and it's frightening. That was tough. Trees died. There were huge fires. And my staff in the Metau were on evacuation order for about a month straight. It was really scary. It was a really tough summer. We were all like, can we just get to fall? Because this is really brutal. So the second story is a little bit different, and it comes from a field visit with a restorationist to a site that he'd been working on for over a decade. So our tour continued down the valley. Sean Gallagher wanted to show me a special part of the watershed, one that was well off any trail. We parked on the side of a dirt road and set out on foot through a dark forest full of moss-covered old growth trees. Ravens were causing a ruckus in the distance, alerting the rest of the forest inhabitants that a couple of rare human visitors were in the neighborhood. We wound our way through large sword ferns that covered the forest floor and under vine maples that shaded the creek. Although we were in the midst of a rare spring drought, the forest still felt damp and cool. But the size of the trees was the most striking aspect of the forest. There were alders over 2 feet in diameter and many hemlock, cedar, and spruce 3 and 4 feet across. After a while, we reached our destination, an immense Sitka spruce at least 6 feet across. Gallagher's guess is that it might be one of the largest spruce in the region, and here it was, its roots twisting through a part of the creek itself, an ancient grove that was now rarely visited by humans. But Gallagher's reason for bringing me to this spot was not only to visit this giant old friend. He wanted to show me what the valley looked like in the past, and what he and others believe it may look like in the future. This stretch of creek, where older age, naturally regenerated forest still exists, is being used as a reference, a historical analog, an environmental baseline for comparison. Measuring success or failure in ecological restoration not only requires setting historical baselines for populations, but also requires establishing reference habitat sites, analog ecological systems that act as controls for comparison or restoration goals. One of the biggest problems that climate change introduces to ecological restoration and ecological monitoring more broadly is the issue of shifting baselines. According to Gallagher, it's one of the last pieces of older forest along the creek. This is what restorationists would call a historical reference site, and it's a common experimental and conceptual tool used to plan a restoration project. But for Gallagher, it was clearly more than that. It was not only a measuring point, but also a source of inspiration, a future imaginary for what this creek could be. He told me, "This is an inspiration, this beautiful forest, the old forest." So this final vignette involves a discussion that I was having with some restorationists who are using beavers and beaver dam analogs, which are human engineered beaver dams, in their restoration work. Jeff Ovson, recently retired as executive director of the Grand Rod Model Watershed, had been experimenting with beaver restoration. He explained the issues of dealing with climate change in restoration. Quote, "The obvious conclusion is going to be that we need to find a way to store water. The motive for some people is that we need to justify building a reservoir. People just don't seem to understand that reservoirs are horribly expensive and problematic. It's expensive. Beavers are really good at storing water. They maintain the storage. There are no pumps. That is probably an oversimplification, but beavers move a lot more than people think." So by incorporating BDAs, or beaver dam analogs, into restoration designs, Process-based restoration is becoming recognized as an important avenue to counteract the effects of climate change. On paper, many restorationists don't explicitly incorporate climate change data or mitigation measures into their designs. But when asked how they're addressing climate change, they often cite process-based restoration as their strategy. Process-based restoration is founded on the idea that if you set natural processes to work, they can restore ecosystem function. For example, Jennifer Molesworth, a fisheries biologist, has also been working in the Methow for almost 2 decades, and she's a sub-basin coordinator for the Bureau of Reclamation. When it comes to her experience in the basin, she explained, quote, "Our approach is more based on physical process. While there is temperature data that gets considered, and we are always looking for groundwater sources and refugia, this is an important part of climate adaptation. We also just want to restore natural river processes and connections. I think our underlying philosophy tends to be where we can restore natural river function and reconnect floodplains and groundwater sources, this will accomplish the goals of preparing for a changing climate. And if we put the river into its naturally functioning state, it will be able to maintain itself and we won't be in a maintenance mode all of the time taking care of artificial things. It will be in a state that theoretically fish are adapted to." She was describing how beavers are capable of restoring long stretches of stream, something that is costly to do by hand and often impossible to do in remote headwater areas. But by reintroducing beavers to areas where they no longer live, advocates of beaver reintroduction programs are hoping to glean these beaver benefits. So I hope that these brief vignettes have given you a little bit of a taste of how managers who are tasked with restoring salmon to a watershed that's undergoing profound changes continue to do so. I wanted to tell these stories and the stories of all the restorationists working across the basin because I think that they really show the creative and adaptive ways that they're working in the face of such wicked and overwhelming environmental problems. And I want to be clear that I'm not trying to paint a rosy and hopeful picture or brush the overwhelming impacts of development, colonialism, and climate change under the rug. Instead, I wanted to tell these restorationist stories because I think it's important to consider the often invisible and overlooked ways that people are adapting to climate change. And this adaptation is also happening in the work of scientists themselves. Within a changed climate, future imaginaries for the field of ecological restoration are still emerging. And some new goals for restoring salmon to the Columbia River Basin are being discussed. One goal may be to simply aim for increasing ecological complexity itself. Another priority may be finding what will move the dial towards species recovery and focusing only on the measures that lead to that. Another tactic may be to shift the priorities of some of the institutions in the basin, such as the Columbia River Treaty, by adding a new goal of a functioning ecosystem to the current goals of hydropower and flood control. The examples demonstrate some of the ways that ecological restorationists struggle with the uncertainty and the shifting goals, expectations, and physical disruptions that climate change introduces to their field. In highlighting the different strategies that restorationists are using and the ways that they deal with environmental change, I wanted to make them visible. Looking to old forests for inspiration just to get by, connecting to cooling groundwater using beavers, flooding forests and looking to headwater habitats for relief and inspiration, These restorationists are part of an epistemic community whose fundamental drive is to restore salmon and their habitat to the Columbia River. So in order to recover salmon in the Columbia River Basin, environmental imaginaries for the river itself may also need to shift with climate change. There's no doubt that there are multiple imagined futures within the basin, and it's highly unlikely that everyone is going to agree on a single imaginary and then work towards it. In the words of one frustrated federal manager, quote, "How much do we value salmon and steelhead, and what are we willing to give up?" In a river basin that's been transformed in order to facilitate an industrial and economic boom powered by hydropower and the irrigation of the desert, there are too many interests at play to naively consider agreement possible. That's not the point of this exercise. Instead, it's to ask, what is the future river that we want to see, and what ways does the science that's being conducted here create or hamper our effort to create this future river? Is it a future river that supports salmon and their ecosystems at whatever the cost? Or a future river that relies on techno-scientific solutions to provide hydropower to the region while attempting to maintain fish populations? Is it a future river ecosystem that survives the drastic environmental changes in store that temporarily became a reality in the 2015 die-offs? And who gets to decide is really a matter of politics and power. But as the Columbia River Basin tribes have demonstrated through continual assertion of their treaty rights at multiple levels, environmental imaginaries have continuity. And when matched with political power, they can become powerful vectors for change. So, by paying attention to what restoration scientists are doing, I think we get a more nuanced story about action, about creativity, and what can happen in the face of large problems. We get another vision for the future and a different environmental imaginary, one that restorationists, the tribes, and many other people across the basin are all working towards. And that's a future Columbia River with salmon. In the words of one restorationist, quote, "Right now, things may feel really negative, and mentally, it's huge. I think there's a little bit of pushback, but we have no choice." Thank you. That's all I have for my talk, but I would really love to engage in discussion and answer any questions that you have, and go deeper into any of these ideas if you'd like. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Shana. Fascinating. And I wanted to, before we get into questions, in terms of if people are interested in purchasing the book, is there a obvious venue for that?
Yes, it's at UW Press. You can buy it, and also you can get it on Amazon or any other local bookseller. But it's a UW Press book. Yeah.
Okay, great. And that UW Press is on our YouTube or on our webpage. Our first question was, can you comment on the role of nonprofit environmental and conservation groups in the restoration of the Columbia Basin?
Yes, they play a huge role. Many of the groups that are actually doing the work of restoring are nonprofit conservation groups that apply for federal or state money in order to conduct restoration. So yes, they play a huge role, absolutely.
And then there was a related to that in terms of, and you kind of mentioned this coming in, but the multiple jurisdictions of tribes and states and nations and nonprofits. Is there any overriding organization that's trying to shepherd all those efforts? I mean, how scattered is the restoration effort community, I guess, is the question there.
There is no overarching entity that's organizing it all. There are some entities that end up funding larger portions of it. For the Northwest Council organizes a lot of where that money is going. The BPA funds a lot of it. And especially, in Canada, it's a whole different story. But in the United States, it's very scattered. Of course, you have some entities that have more legal power, and some entities that don't. But it's really a kind of a network, kind of patchwork of people who are all working towards the same goal. You find people kind of coming together in particular venues, I think, salmon recovery conferences or the Society for Ecological Restoration, for instance. But it's a scattered effort, to be sure.
Right. Yeah. Someone was asking what drew you to the Columbia River Basin for your research and your book, and I guess related to that is sort of your background coming into your position at UW.
Yeah, so I have an interdisciplinary background. I went to Evergreen, got my bachelor's there. And then I have a master's in cultural studies and a master's in global environmental politics and society. And then I have a PhD in water resources, law, policy, and management. So this project came about during my time at the University of Idaho studying water policy. And I was part of a research project that was a group of about 25 people, and we were all tasked with looking at climate change in the Columbia River Basin from many, many different angles. And, there were hydrologists. It was an interdisciplinary team of people working on this. And I really became interested in this question of how restorationists were continuing to work in the face of all of this adversity and change. So I was also studying restoration at the time. And so I kind of I flipped the perspective and kind of went into the sociology of science and to study scientists themselves and what they were doing. So a lot of my background is in science studies. And then I end up at the Human-Centered Design and Engineering, which is a very interesting world because it's in an engineering department, but we focus on trying to understand how humans interact with technology, which is actually very related to the way people manage the environment, particularly in a case like the Columbia River Basin. As I was saying, that's really like an organic machine and a kind of social, technical, environmental confluence there. So I really have an interdisciplinary background, and I would encourage students as well to, be bold and pursue interdisciplinary work, because I think it can be really rewarding.
Yeah, definitely. And part of that adaptive strategy. Question about your thoughts on gill netting salmon, both commercially and subsistence on the Columbia, and how that plays in and the attention it needs or doesn't get.
I guess I wouldn't really be able to speak to it from a management perspective, because I don't know enough about gill netting itself. I mean, historically, of course, one of the big impacts to salmon populations was the canneries along the Columbia in the early part of the 1900s, and that really impacted the population. But current fishing patterns, I am afraid that I don't know enough about to speak to. Sorry.
That's fine. One of our viewers was asking about the book Water Wars, if you've read that, and it says that they are looking forward to reading your book and comparing it.
Oh, great. Yes, absolutely. Yes, I do know that book. I think there's Yeah, there's so many interesting things to be said about water management, obviously. And I think that it's just every place has such a different and unique relationship to water. And we're really in a really interesting region here in the Pacific Northwest because we have endangered, we have endangered salmon and in the Columbia River Basin. And that really changes the way that we manage for water and manage fish. And that's one of the things I get a little bit more into in the book is that kind of unique legal landscape that we have that sets up a really particular scientific landscape as well with the Endangered Species Act. So yeah, I would love to hear what you think of my book. So definitely
Great.
get in touch.
The next question was regarding the number of Columbia dams that are in BC versus in the States. And I guess I would tag not just number, but size of those dams.
Mhm.
And how the BC, is there a similar urgency on the BC side in terms of the Endangered Species Act, in terms of restoration? And again, back to that earlier question of coordination.
Great question. So can you still see the screen? See this map here?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. So, this is not, it's kind of a rough map, but it gives you an idea here. So if there are some very major dams up in British Columbia, but those dams are mainly for flood control, and they're regulated through the Columbia Basin Treaty between the United States and Canada. And their flood control for the United States. So Canada is actually very impacted. The people in those communities along the Columbia River up in British Columbia are extremely impacted by our need for flood control downstream. But there's an agreement there, the Columbia River Treaty, that sets up the way that water is managed and that flood control is managed. And it's very complex. I could go on about it, but we actually, no salmon can, I wish I could point to the screen. I can't really, but no salmon can right now get up the main stem past Chief Joseph and Grand Coulee Dam. So the places that they're restoring salmon in Canada and the Canadian side are the Okanagan River. And they're actually doing a lot of work up there and getting a lot of results in having salmon come back up there. But it's an international issue that extends out into the ocean, right? And I didn't even get into the ocean, of course, because we have the salmon migrating throughout the entire North Pacific and all of the international waters that they travel through. So, one of the things that I discuss and I really think is important is using legal devices like the Columbia River Treaty to incorporate environmental values into them. Because right now, the Columbia River Treaty is only about power and flood control. It's being renegotiated right now, or it will be soon. And so this is a chance to use a tool like the Columbia River Treaty and include a kind of third prong, as they're calling it, which would be ecological health in there as well. So I think that there are tools like that out there that policymakers can use. And if there's, the will to, or pressure, whichever way you want to think of it, put on those policymakers, then they can be used to really make a huge difference. I hope that answers your question.
Great, thank you. Question of, is there any chance of removing any of those major salmon blocking dams and replacing them with beaver dams?
I don't know if beavers can build dams as big as the Grand Coulee. Yeah, dam removal, of course, is a huge issue. Yeah, and I do not know of any real legal mechanism at the moment to breach those dams. But I'm sure there are people working on those issues that may be able to in the future. I mean, it's been very interesting in the court system. If anyone's been following it, the last judge did actually say that dam removal needs to be considered. So, and it is talked about at most major conferences on salmon recovery. So it's out there. I don't know if beavers want to build the dam that big, but.
There's the related, I guess, follow-up question was, does the possibility of future dam removal, that would obviously greatly change both upstream and downstream. So does that play into adaptive restoration discussions? I mean, how does one plan for that? Both those possibilities.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think anybody's planning for it right now. But there are discussions, and I'm not an advocate for dams in any way, but there are people talking about some of the ways that some of the headwater dams, such as the Dworshak Dam in Idaho, hold a lot of very cold water that can be used to release into the main stem when there's really hot summers. So water release and holding water in the mountains using some of those dams that are already existing is talked about as an adaptive management possibility. And so I think that kind of rethinking the way that dams are being used is probably a worthwhile effort for people who are looking to adapt to climate change.
Yeah. And then there's one more follow-up on the topic of beavers, and that is there a way of, I guess, coordinating beaver dam building with existing dams, of adapting, beaver dams? And you sort of mentioned that a little bit, but how close can we bring the beaver dams to even replace, or,
right.
Some of.
I think that there are discussions about that, yes. So if we're talking about, not the mega dams, the large scale dams, but talking about smaller irrigation dams, absolutely. I think that people can use, there are studies going on right now to measure the amount of cold water that beavers are able to hold in headwaters using their own dams. And it is quite a lot. And I think that people are talking about, as I read in the vignette, that, people are discussing, like, should we put in a reservoir to kind of keep colder, water up in the mountains when we don't have snowpack? People who are beaver dam advocates are saying, like, no, let's not build a reservoir. Let's not put in more concrete. Let's, use beavers as much as we can to create this kind of wetland forest or whatever it might be to hold water in there naturally. So yes, I think on a smaller scale, not a hydroelectric dam scale, but on a smaller scale, absolutely, yeah.
Great. Question, are there opportunities for students to be involved with ongoing restoration or monitoring efforts on the Columbia?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of opportunities. I think the place to get in touch would be the Northwest chapter of the Society for Ecological Restoration. There's opportunities through there, and also River Restoration Northwest. Those would be two places that I would look for opportunities. And I mean, most counties have some opportunities, in regional restorations, tree plantings, monitoring, things like that. I know where I live, we have several citizen science restoration and monitoring programs, including like salmon watchers and Coast, which is also a citizen science monitoring program. So I think those are great ways to get involved. Absolutely.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And so I think you've addressed most of our questions. We've had a number of panelists or attendees chime in saying thank you and appreciating both the presentation and your answers. And maybe we'll have to bring you back to get the ocean side of the story at a future date. I want to remind everyone that we'll be back next week with Shannon Crossan is our guest, a wildlife biologist, talking about tools for integrating ecosystem connectivity into planning. Shanna, thank you very much for spending the afternoon with us. And I believe that.
Thanks for having me, and reach out if you want. My email is there, so I'd love to hear from people.
Yeah, can you bounce back to that your last screen one more time with your email contact so people?
Yeah. There you go.
Great. All right. Thank you, Shanna.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Good afternoon, everybody.